Something happened in the Strait of Hormuz on Thursday night that deserves more careful attention than it has received. Not because it was unexpected. Those of us who study the architecture of ceasefire agreements have been warning about exactly this kind of fragility for months, but because of what it reveals about the deeper structural tensions that no peace memorandum, however carefully worded, can paper over on its own. Let me begin with what we actually know and be honest about what we do not. Both the United States and Iran exchanged fire in the Strait of Hormuz. Both sides claim the other struck first. The U.S. Central Command described the Iranian attack as unprovoked, stating that American guided missile destroyers were simply transiting the strait, a routine passage, when Iranian forces launched missiles, drones, and small boats against them. Iran's top military command tells an entirely different story. They say American forces targeted an Iranian oil tanker and a second vessel approaching the strait, and that aerial strikes hit coastal positions at Bandar Khamir, Sirik, and Keshem Island. They responded, they say, out of necessity, and they inflicted significant damage on American vessels. Now, I want you to sit with that contradiction for a moment, because this is not merely a dispute over facts. This is a structural feature of how these kinds of confrontations work. Both governments need to present themselves to their own domestic audiences as reactive, not aggressive. Both have institutional incentives to frame every action as a response. In that environment, determining who truly fired first becomes almost secondary to understanding why the situation produced fire at all. The Strait of Hormuz is not an ordinary piece of water. Roughly a tenth of the world's total oil supply passes through that narrow channel every single day. There is no meaningful alternative route. You can reroute around the Cape of Good Hope for bulk cargo. You can shut the Suez Canal, but the Hormuz Strait is a choke point without a bypass, and every serious actor in this conflict knows it. That is precisely why both sides position forces there, and precisely why any incident in those waters carries immediate global consequences. In commodity markets, in diplomatic capitals, in the calculations of third-party states watching from a cautious distance. The United Arab Emirates reported that its air defenses were actively engaging with an Iranian missile and drone attack in the early hours of Friday morning. That is a significant escalation, and I think it is being underreported. When a third-party Gulf state, one that has been carefully managing its relationship with Tehran, finds itself under active aerial attack, the conflict has moved beyond a bilateral American-Iranian confrontation. It has begun to pull in the architecture of the broader Gulf security order. What makes this moment especially complicated is the timing. Just the day before these exchanges, Iran's foreign ministry had publicly acknowledged that a U.S. proposal, a 14-point memorandum of understanding, was under active consideration, and that Tehran would be sharing its views with Pakistani mediators. Pakistan's foreign minister had gone further, expressing hope that this ceasefire could be transformed into a permanent end to the war. That language, permanent end, was careful and deliberate. It was the kind of language that diplomats choose when they want to signal seriousness without triggering domestic hardliners. And yet, within 24 hours of those statements, there were explosions in the strait, air defense systems lighting up over the UAE, and reports of explosions heard in Tehran itself. This is the central paradox of the current situation, and it is one that scholars of conflict termination have documented across dozens of cases. The period immediately following a ceasefire announcement is often the most dangerous phase of a conflict, not the safest. Both sides retain military forces in close proximity. Both sides have hardliners in parliament, in the military command, in the ideological establishment, who view any compromise as surrender. The ceasefire creates a kind of pressure cooker. The diplomatic track moves slowly, the military machinery remains coiled, and any incident, however ambiguous its origins, can release that pressure violently. President Trump's response on Truth Social is worth analyzing carefully, not for its rhetoric, which was characteristic, but for its underlying message. He confirmed the ceasefire was still in place. He described the Iranian forces as having been destroyed beautifully. And then, and this is the part that matters strategically, he issued a direct ultimatum: sign the deal fast or face something far worse. That is a negotiating posture, not a declaration of war. Trump is doing what he has done throughout his political career, using military action as leverage in what he frames fundamentally as a transactional relationship. The violence in his framework is a price signal. It is meant to move Iran toward the negotiating table, not away from it. Iran's response, by contrast, is more fractured, and that fracture is itself the key analytical variable. The government is considering the memorandum. The foreign ministry is engaging with mediators. But a senior member of the Parliamentary Foreign Policy Commission publicly called the 14 points a wish list and warned that Iran has its finger on the trigger. That kind of public divergence between the executive and legislative tracks is not noise, it is signal. It tells us that Supreme Leader Khamenei has not yet consolidated a unified position, and that any agreement reached at the diplomatic level will face serious domestic resistance before it can be implemented. Pakistan's role deserves more attention than it has received in Western coverage. Islamabad has positioned itself as the essential intermediary, the one channel through which proposals travel in both directions. Pakistan has its own strategic interests here. A prolonged American-Iranian conflict destabilizes the broader Islamic world, strains Pakistan's relationships in the Gulf, and creates refugee and economic pressures that Islamabad cannot afford. Pakistani mediation is not altruistic, it is rational. And that rationality makes it more reliable than mediation driven purely by principle. The absence of Israeli involvement, confirmed by Israeli sources to the BBC, is also analytically meaningful. Operation Epic Fury, the initial American-Israeli offensive, has formally concluded, according to Secretary Rubio. Israel stepping back from direct participation suggests that the military phase, at least from Jerusalem's perspective, has achieved its objectives, whatever those were, and that the current moment is being managed primarily as an American-Iranian bilateral issue, with Israel watching carefully from the side. What is the realistic range of outcomes from here? The most optimistic scenario is that Thursday night's exchange functions as what strategists sometimes call a costly signal. Both sides demonstrated capacity. Both sides absorbed a strike. Neither side escalated to the level that would force the other into full mobilization. In that reading, the violence paradoxically clears space for negotiation. Each side can tell its domestic audience that it did not back down, and therefore the concessions made in future talks are not weakness, but strategy. This has happened before. The 1988 tanker war ended not through decisive victory, but through mutual exhaustion and a shared calculation that the costs of continuation exceeded the costs of compromise. The more concerning scenario is one I would characterize as unintentional escalation through institutional momentum. Military commanders on both sides are operating under rules of engagement that authorize proportional response. If Iranian forces near the strait interpret an American transit as threatening, correctly or incorrectly, they have authority to respond. If American forces receive incoming fire, genuine or misidentified, they respond. Each response triggers the next. The political leadership in Washington and Tehran finds itself managing a military escalation that neither side fully initiated and neither side fully controls. History is full of wars that no government actually wanted, but that no government proved capable of stopping once the machinery was in motion. The 14-point memorandum is, at its core, an attempt to build a framework that reduces the surface area for exactly that kind of unintentional escalation. If missile launch sites and command nodes are dismantled as part of a verifiable agreement, the probability of accidental ignition decreases. The question is whether the political conditions exist on both sides to reach that agreement before the next incident, and whether the next incident will be contained as this one appears to have been, or whether it will carry a different weight. Trump has said the bombing will restart at a much higher level and intensity if Iran does not agree to a deal. Iran's parliamentary voices have said Iran will deliver a harsh and regret-inducing response if the United States does not grant the necessary conditions. Both statements are simultaneously true to the people who made them. Both are simultaneously posturing, and genuine. The dangerous thing about ultimatums is that they are most credible precisely when they should not be tested. And the current moment is one in which both sides appear prepared to test each other repeatedly, right up to the edge of what neither side claims to want. I have studied this region for over 2 decades. I have watched ceasefires collapse and hold, watched diplomatic frameworks dissolve in the face of a single miscalculated strike, watched leaders who wanted peace find themselves trapped by the logic of the wars they presided over. What I can tell you with confidence is this: the next 72 hours matter more than any public statement made in the last week. If the diplomatic channels remain open, if Pakistan continues to carry proposals in both directions, and if the military forces on both sides exercise the restraints that their political leaders are publicly claiming to endorse, then there is a genuine path toward a structured agreement. It is narrow. It requires discipline that the last 24 hours have not demonstrated. But it exists. Whether anyone chooses to walk it, that is a different question entirely.